I'm recording to the cloud and let's go. Let me welcome you all to the event. Thank you so much for coming. This is the QualLab Lunch series that we started last year and backed by popular demand. We weren't sure if people wanted to still have this, but yes, people do want to talk about research and different questions and engage and all that. So I'm Penny Pasque. I am a professor in Ed Studies as well as the director of QualLab, which just started this past summer. And so we're gonna have a little housekeeping, then introductions, where I'll hand it over to Bakari and he will introduce Dr. San Pedro. So here, just housekeeping, please turn on your video if you're able, if you're willing. We'd love to see you. If not, that's just fine. It's up to you. And then we like Q&A, not always just in the chat. If you put it in the chat, Bakari will certainly ask your question when possible, but at the end, we'll do a Q&A where you can turn off your microphone and actually ask a question. And, you know, it just feels a little more personal that way. We are recording it. The video will be available online. If you're interested in closed captions for any of these events, just let us know. If you can give us a heads up, that's always helpful so that we can bring somebody in to do the closed caption. And then, of course, our websites for more information about our program and events. So here's the outline. First, we're doing housekeeping and welcome. This is it. And so then we'll turn it over to Bakari, who will introduce Dr. San Pedro. Then Dr. San Pedro will run his presentation with you all. He asked for small group introduction conversations just to get everybody engaged and warm up. Then the presentation, then we'll do Q&A for the rest of the time. The last few minutes will just be where we'll tell you about the other events that we have going on. So let me introduce and turn it over to Bakari Lumumba.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pasque. So I will be introducing Dr. Timothy San Pedro. He is an associate professor of multicultural and equity studies in the Department of Teaching and Learning here at The Ohio State University. Dr. San Pedro's scholarship focuses on the intricate link between motivation, engagement, and identity construction to curricular and pedagogical practices that refocus content and conversations upon Indigenous histories, perspectives, and literacies. He has worked with the Native American Next Step program in Arizona to expand Native American subjects and content in Phoenix area schools, as well as led professional development workshops on the Navajo reservation that co-constructed and co-envisioned lessons and pedagogical decisions to sustain and support the cultures of students. His co-authored chapter with Valerie Kinlock in Humanizing Research, titled The Space Between Listening and Storying, Foundations for Projects in Humanization, examines how trust, vulnerabilities, the development of relationships or storying provide spaces to engage in transformative resistances and praxis in academic, community, and research settings with participants. 2 publications are in press with the Journal of American Indian Education and Research and Teaching of English. He serves as the chair of the Department of Teaching and Learning's Equity and Diversity Committee and is a member of the Standing Committee on Research for the National Council of Teachers of English. Please help me welcome Dr. Timothy San Pedro.
Am I up? I'm sorry.
Absolutely.
Okay. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, to see a lot of familiar faces, and just to talk a little bit about the latest research that I've been doing. I actually just turned in the final manuscript this past week, and they sent me the first draft of the cover of our book that we co-authored and co-wrote. So I'm excited to share a little bit about this work, to tease into it, and to talk about Indigenous research methodologies, as well as the intersections of projects in humanization and culturally sustaining and revitalizing pedagogy as well. So I'm happy to be here today. And as I do in all my classes, we kind of start out by getting into breakout groups and just kind of get the conversation started. And it's good, even in a virtual space, to see one another, but not be overwhelmed by the numbers of how many people you're seeing. So there's just a couple of questions that I have. Yeah, thank you. To kind of enter into the conversation in the presentation that I have today. So I would like for everyone to just briefly introduce yourself in the breakout rooms. There'll be 4 to 5 people, however you want to introduce yourselves. Those are just suggestions. And then there are a couple of research premises that I would like you to just consider. And if you have a moment or a time after you introduce yourselves to think through these and how they apply maybe to your research or how you're thinking about research. The first one is, we locate and are located by our past, where we were raised, the lessons passed down to us, the friendships created, nurtured, and sustained over time. And the second one is, the stories shared between researchers and those we work with are sacred gifts offered to one another because of mutual and dialogic respect, reciprocity, and answerability, held within the creation, development, and sustenance of relationships. And that's actually how I'll start my presentation. But I just wanted to give you all an opportunity to kind of sit with those and think about those as you're introducing yourselves in the breakout rooms. Penny, you do what I do. I like have to verbalize through what I'm doing to get Zoom going.
Yes, yes. Well, here we go.
All right.
Random breakout rooms, and we'll see you in
Yay.
about 10 minutes. Does that sound right, Tim? Or?
Yeah, that sounds good. All right. Well, thanks for engaging in that breakout session. I think it's just important to see one another in this day and age, even if it is virtually. So thanks for introducing yourself, sharing a little bit about who you are, and maybe your connection and why you're here today. So I'm just going to start with a brief land acknowledgement. That's specific to Ohio, that's specific to Columbus, that's specific to Ohio State. So Indigenous peoples have been coming to what is now the state of Ohio for thousands of years, and the series of large-scale geometric boundary and effigy earthworks still visible in central and southern Ohio bear witness to our region's historical importance as a center for economic, spiritual, artistic, and intellectual endeavors and exchanges. Central Ohio is a traditional homeland of the Shawnee, Delaware, Wyandot, and Miami peoples, and other Indigenous nations also have strong ties to this area. So over 100 years ago, in October 1911, the Society of American Indians, the first American Indian activist association organized and run by Native peoples themselves, held its first meeting on the campus of The Ohio State University. And today, individuals from a broad range of Indigenous backgrounds call Columbus and Central Ohio home. The Ohio State University is a land-grant university, which often assumes that the land offered to construct university systems was empty and available. Such an understanding erases the fact that Indigenous peoples belong to these lands and were often forcibly removed from them. So this university exists on lands dispossessed from Indigenous peoples. So I just wanted to start by that, with that land acknowledgement to sort of just frame where we're at historically and currently. So I'm going to share my screen and begin my presentation. And I'll locate myself as well. So this is, there we go. This is a picture of where I grew up, the Flathead Indian Reservation in Polson, Montana. And because of the work I do, because of where I was raised, it's often assumed that I'm Native American, but I'm not. I'm Filipino American. That grew up and was surrounded and welcomed into the families and homes of the Salish, Kootenai, and Pend Oreille peoples there. And it's with their support and love that I continue to do the work that I do and attempt to answer questions that have been central in relation to education and the role of schooling in our education. And so I began with two premises, two statements. One was, we locate and are located by our past, where we were raised, the lessons passed down to us, the friendships created, nurtured, and sustained over time. And the stories shared between researchers and those we work with are sacred gifts offered to one another because of mutual and dialogic respect, reciprocity, and answerability held within the creation, development, and sustenance of relationships. And so I'll be talking about those statements today. So we as researchers with a platform to amplify people's stories have a responsibility to honor such gifts by shaping their stories with them in a way that honors the original intentions of story sharing. And so this premise means that research projects should resist unidirectional extractive methodologies. By unidirectional, I mean to address Western research methodologies that have long bolstered objectivity, reliability, and quote truth by separating our stories as researchers from participant stories. Doing so, I have argued with Sandy Grande and Sweeney Winchief, masks the power dynamics inherent in social settings and taints the quote objectivity researchers are seeking. We ask, what is at stake and whose interests are served in a power dynamic where only one person is asked to reveal themselves? And so forwarding relational research methods, I titled today's presentation, Centering Relationships in Research, Reciprocity, and Answerability, which is based on my latest project where I'm working with 5 Native American mothers and their children to better understand the ways lessons of indigeneity, of language, of culture are taught in the home so that we as researchers and educators can find more productive ways of making schooling spaces to reflect Indigenous students' knowledges, beliefs, and stories. The women I have had the pleasure of working with throughout this project are those from long-standing and established relationships from high school, from college, and beyond. Friendships with Faith and Tara and Christina and Michael and Elena, as well as their children, Mali, Wadukti, Kailin, Sila, Demetrius, and Dahlia. Each of these strong, caring, and transformative Native American women in my life have played crucial roles in my development. They taught me courage, showed me unconditional love, taught me how to be better, helped me see that family connects beyond blood. And while there are also amazing fathers a part of these families, I focus on the stories of mothers and their children because of my longstanding relationships that we've had over the years. And having remained in their lives, I saw their families grow and their children getting older. I saw the pride and hope they had for each other. I saw stories of language and tribal revitalization, of critical consciousness development, of pushing back, of teaching their children how to navigate unjust systems, especially educational systems. Through this project, we have an opportunity to amplify the stories we care about, the stories that we hope impact our communities in productive ways. But to do this, I've had to engage in a process of unlearning Western research norms. I remember vividly feeling unease when my instructors, when I was in grad school, would attempt to indoctrinate me with methodological statements such as, to be a reliable researcher, you cannot be too close to your work. You need to distance in order to analyze data accurately. And objectivity is not achievable if close relationships are created. And so I turned to Sarah Florence Davidson's call, who says we need a methodology that allows us to be our authentic selves, that is an extension of who we are as researchers and human beings. To answer this call, I rely on the intersections of these three spheres: projects in humanization, Indigenous research methodologies, and culturally sustaining and revitalizing pedagogy. Valerie Kinloch and I, in considering a methodology that allows us to be our authentic selves, sought to reframe research as projects in humanization. We argued that it is crucial for educational research to stop hiding behind the facade that relationships have no bearing upon the work we do. Projects in humanization seeks to recenter three tenets to research. One is relationships in research, both the creation and sustenance of those relationships. Two is the co-construction of knowledge, the capacity to listen, story, and care about each other. And three is story sharing, both the listening and voicing of stories. And so when our stories, life experiences, and racial identities are shared with those we work with, knowledge is co-constructed because we listen closely and carefully to the stories of others, which over time leads to ongoing opportunities for trust and relationship building. Another sphere is Indigenous research methodologies, which centers connections to people, to place, to relationships, and to land. It relies on Indigenous knowledge systems to promote, protect, and preserve Indigenous languages, cultures, land, and people. And it moves beyond settler colonial gaze of deficit and damage and toward desire and hope. Indigenous research methodology centers crucial relationships not just between humans, but also our connection to land and to place. And finally, culturally sustaining and revitalizing pedagogy is an anti-settler colonial, anti-imperial project. It exists wherever education sustains the life ways of communities who have been and continue to be damaged and erased through schooling. And it works to sustain minds and bodies rather than assimilate to dominant norms. Culturally sustaining and revitalizing pedagogy seeks to decenter whiteness and settler colonialism in schooling spaces while centering community knowledge systems. And so I've envisioned storying as a method within the convergence of these three spheres. Storying is the space between sharing and hearing of stories, something that I have referred to as the dialogic spiral in prior publications, which are two-way reciprocal conversations. It relies on the premise that shared knowledge is never void of relationships, but always located in the development of them. And relies also on the framing from Lee Patel, who says we should see ourselves as stewards not of specific pieces of knowledge, but rather of the productive and generative spaces that allow for finding knowledge. And so, what does relational research forwarding storying as a method, what does it look like? So working with 5 Native families, it has looked something like this. Before the IRB was written, I visited my friends' homes in Washington and Montana and North Dakota. And during that time, we co-constructed our project's purpose, our questions, and direction. In total, we had 35 conversations, 1 hour to 3 hours in length, that were done over video software of their choice, either Facebook, Google Hangouts, or Skype. Zoom was not a part of our world at that point. And we culminated the project by coming together for a group conversation that we called the Montana Gathering. It was a short period where we spent time together on the Flathead Indian Reservation, learning our stories, seeing the connection between stories, and understanding the unique differences of our stories. And currently we are co-authoring our stories for publication. And I'd love to talk more about that in the Q&A. So I'll just show a couple of storying sessions between the mothers and their children and me so that you can see what relational research forwarding storying methods looks like for our project. And so in this first story, Sila shares a story about her internal feelings when being nudged by her mother, Tara, to speak in front of the sitting council to change Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. Tara, after Sila shares her recollection of the story, shares her reasonings behind her decision to nudge Sila to engage in this public speaking opportunity. Oh, I'm worried. One second.
We
Can you hear it?
had,
Okay.
she was like, hey, you're speaking. She was like, hey, do you want to come? And then she's like, by the way, you're speaking tonight. She likes to do that to me.
Yeah.
She's like, tell me, and like, oh yeah, you're speaking. Oh, great, cool. I'll do that.
Well, talk about that, like her pushing you to speak.
At times I'm like, why? I wasn't prepared for this. But
Yeah.
it's really nice because I guess it's proof to me that I can speak in front of people, and like I don't need to like meticulously go over every single word that I'm saying because it will just flow, especially when I believe in something a lot. And I've also learned that I cry even when I am prepared. That's just something that I do. And that was the first time I was like in front of a big group of people, and I was terrified. I was like, oh no, I'm gonna say something wrong, I'm gonna talk too long, this is just gonna be a complete disaster. Unsurprisingly, it wasn't. Turned out pretty well. I made people in the audience cry, which was very surprising, I guess. And I didn't realize like how much I could affect people until that moment.
And so within that exchange there, and in all of the interviews that I had, I did not have any prepared questions. What I would do is I would re-listen to our previous conversation and just have that fresh on my mind as far as the stories that they shared. And when things came up, I served as a story supporter. So if they were touching on topics or ideas that they had touched on previously, I would make sure to help them in connecting their thoughts together. And so as you see there, the questions were generated on the spot based on how they were directing the conversation and leading in that conversation. It did not start this interview by saying, I would really like to hear about your time speaking to the city council. It organically came up. It was a story that was important to her. And the same with Tara, her mother, when she speaks about this as well.
She doesn't necessarily, but I do think that nudge, I knew that if I didn't break through her not feeling like she had a right to say anything, or her feeling like too scared to do it, or like, really pushing her, that she would never discover her voice and never discover her power in the same way, like being able to do that kind of work.
Yeah.
Well, I think she's discovered that she's powerful and that her voice is needed in the world, and that she brings a unique intersectionality, right? Like she's super unique, and her story is very demonstrative of how the world works in sometimes not so good of ways, but how somehow that only just made her stronger and more unique and more powerful. And I think she feels that. I think she feels really like I'm meant to be an advocate, and this is one way I can use my power. And her power really is, her ability to challenge systems, her ability to see the system, all of that. And I think she sees them as opportunities to just get better now.
Yeah.
And so just within that exchange, you see the intergenerational lessons that are being transferred from mother to daughter, and the careful nudges that Tara is offering Sila as she is engaging in this important and responsible act of voicing to power. And so that nudge became a central component of their stories in the book that we wrote, and it was because of the direction that they took those stories that we centered them within the book. And so I'll just share one more story, and then we can get into the Q&A. But this story is one between Dahlia and Faith, and with them, they both wanted to be a part of the conversation at the same time, whereas in other conversations, they were one-on-one. But that really gave insight into this opportunity that you'll see here, where Dahlia is sharing an important moment in her life with her mother for the very first time. And you'll see that although I begin with the question, I fade into the background because I know how crucial and important it is for them to have this exchange. And you don't see it because my screen is so small, but I have goosebumps all over my body, bearing witness to this such a beautiful and important moment in both of their lives, and just so thankful that they included me within that moment as well. And so just for a little bit of context, Dahlia is talking about a Humanities 110 course that all freshmen at her college, undergraduate college, are required to take. And that humanities course centers white men, essentially, and no other paradigms or understandings other than Western European. And so she's pushing here and invited into a meeting on how they ought to revise or consider revising that so that she and her story and her community stories can be seen within a course that's so central to that university.
Hey, Dahlia, do you remember taking that American Indian Studies class and like reaching out to your mom about all these different things? Do you remember those conversations?
Yeah, I remember because I would get done like around 6:30 at night, and then I'd just call her like on my way home or something.
Yeah.
Or like when I got home, and I'd just like rant to her and be like, "Oh my gosh, this happened. Did you know this?" And then I said this.
I just remember her telling me, like, I realized at some point this was the first time she'd had an American Indian teacher in her entire life.
Yeah.
Like, never throughout elementary, middle school, high school, none of that. But I remember her saying to me that she felt like she could contribute to this class and her voice really mattered because she knew about these things and they were relative to her life. And I just thought, that is so important. That's so key. And I mean, to go through your whole educational career without having that feeling, it's wrong.
Yeah.
But go ahead, I can see.
Wait, Mom, did I tell you that I was chosen for like representative of my whole department?
No, for what?
For they're bringing 3 college, like from Columbia, Dartmouth, and Bard University. They're bringing outside evaluators for Hum 110. And so each department got to choose a representative. So I went, and this was on Wednesday, and no one was critiquing the content at all. And I was just like, I ranted, and it was nice in like a civilized way. I ranted.
Oh, I'm so proud of you. Yay. I'm glad someone said something. Nobody said anything?
No, okay. So all they did was talk about how, are the lectures effective? Do you like the style of the lectures? Blah, blah, blah. Do you like how you have little conferences? Blah, blah, blah. So they're only talking about like the pedagogy instead of like the actual content of the class. And so like it was getting like towards the last 15 minutes of this hour-long kind of thing. And so I finally participated. I was like, I just wanted to like talk about how the content of this course privileges like Western knowledge systems and how it affects people who aren't from this background. And if Reed really wants to focus on diversity and inclusivity, they wouldn't make this the single required course. And because it like makes people with different backgrounds uncomfortable in participating. And
they're mainly arguing that a conference style course was like necessary to kind of get into like the read mindset. And I'm like, it doesn't make me want to participate if first of all we're critiquing the problems in the material. And I was like, I'm not saying that there's not value in like Aristotle, but we can't just let people go through 4 years of read without critiquing a single thing. And so I was saying stuff like that. And then I was like, and like, since I'm like a brown woman and there's all these things that are racist and sexist, and it's not my job to bring up these critiques and stuff like that. And I was like, why can't we have like different courses offered for different groups and blah, blah, blah. And so then I was done, and then everyone was uncomfortable, and I was just sitting there kind of angry. And then and then they kind of like moved on, and then this one like white girl who's sitting next to me like 5 minutes after I got done was like, well, I just really agree with you and blah blah blah. And I was like, sweet. But then afterwards, after she agreed with me, then everyone was like, oh yeah, it was a good point. So it took like a white girl to agree with me for people to care. But
yeah.
I'm so proud of you. That's awesome.
I was really fired up. I was going to talk to you about it, but I was
yeah.
Yeah, and so those were just a couple of snippets into the conversations that we had. And within that one in particular, again, they were directing the conversation. It wasn't a prepared question that I had that led them there. It was something that was important and pertinent to their lives to share with one another. And since then, you know, we have co-authored, co-drafted the chapters, and within the book itself, they are co-authors and the first author in each of the chapters. So it reads, for example, there, Faith Price, Dahlia Killsback, and Timothy San Pedro for their chapter. And what we did when we engaged in the restoring of their stories was I would take a first crack at, you know, engaging in the transcripts, transitioning them into narrative form, with our communities in mind, with my mom in mind, with the people that we care about in mind, so that it's accessible and that it's centering the emotions and feelings that were shared within the stories in the first place. And so those initial drafts of the chapters were shared with the mothers and their children, and from that point, it was a negotiated space. Where we ask questions like, you know, imagine an audience beyond us. What are some of the questions or some of the stories that were shared that were just meant to be between you and me? And because of that, some stories were removed. There are also moments where I got some information wrong that they corrected and updated. And they also had an opportunity to revise to make their stories powerful and impactful as they move forward. And so in that process of co-authoring, co-analyzing, we generated the knowledge and the stories that were shared collectively within the book itself. And so, yeah, we're at that stage now where we're celebrating because it's submitted, it's in the works, and we're actually thinking about engaging in another book project where their names are on the front cover of the book, as we think about the methods centered in Indigenous research methodologies, projects in humanization, CSP, how those were used throughout the process. And it's not just my story, it's our collective story in the ways that we went about that work. So that's just a thought for now. But I'm excited for the book to reach all of you, and that you might be able to see how those narratives impact your stories, your communities, and your lives as well. So just want to thank everyone for being here, for being a part of this conversation, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Bakari's gonna facilitate the Q&A. I know you could have put things, he reminded you could put things in the chat, but also please unmute yourself, throw out a question, and let's engage.
So we have a question from, we have a lot of questions coming in, right? Be careful what you ask for. So the first question that we have is, how compatible is Indigenous research methodologies with the IRB process?
Mm. Ooh, yeah, that's a really good question. I think we need to think about the root of the IRB, the reason that it was created in the first place. It was created because institutions and researchers were going into communities and being untruthful in the purposes of their projects. We have many horrible examples in all minoritized communities of people entering into data collection and using that data collection for harm. And so the IRB essentially is, in my opinion, an instrument originally intended to protect communities, but I think it's morphed into a tool to protect institutions.
Mm.
And so I think when we're thinking about Indigenous research methodologies, that is happening all the time anyway, right? That research is happening concurrently, intergenerationally, in our communities all the time. Those of us who work with young children, or anyone really, who is exploring and understanding their world, are asking questions and going on explorations in understanding ways in which to answer those questions. And so to answer the question directly, I think that there's work that is done before the IRB process even comes in, and that's what I tried to share within the story earlier. Is that I asked them if I was able to devote my time. This is my job, right? I'm a scholar and a researcher. If I was to devote my time and energy into a project that looked at the beauty of their lives, the intergenerational learning that occurs in their lives, what might that look like? And so it wasn't me saying, here are the questions, here's the scope of the work, here's the direct question that I'm going to ask IRB. It was us collaborating and co-constructing that question early on that then I transferred into language that the institutions can understand through the IRB process.
Okay, very good, very good. So we have another question that asked about centering, margins, and framing, and how is that useful in terms of doing the research?
Can whoever asked that question, can you extend that a little bit?
Yeah, I asked the question. I'm sorry. Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah.
I think I'm a second-year doctoral student, so I'm trying to learn the language of the institution, and center and margins framing is used so often, and I've even seen it co-opted. I mean, by the current administration, and so I wonder how useful it is, because I understand it when you use it, but I'm fearful of using it just because it can be co-opted.
Can you? I feel like my understanding of margins framing might be a little bit different from yours. Can you provide just a description of what that means, not only for me, but the other people who are here?
I'm not very knowledgeable about it. That's what I'm asking.
Oh, well, I'm not very knowledgeable about it either, I guess. Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer it because I'm unfamiliar with the term, to be honest. I don't know, Dr. Pasqua, if you have an understanding of it that we can build from this question.
I'm not familiar in particular with the research that you're talking about, but it is reminding me of whose voices get centered, what are on the margins, and the ways in which some of the Indigenous research really is about centering Indigenous perspectives and not necessarily white people's dominant methodologies and perspectives, which is is just one idea.
No, thank you. That helps me. Jamila Lyascott, she's a famous scholar, and she just wrote a book, Black Appetite, White Food, and she uses this metaphor of working so hard to get a seat at the table, but when you get to that table, the food is intentionally inedible to us. And so I think that metaphor is useful in thinking about buzzwords that are out there, such as inclusion. Inclusion into what, and what needs to be erased or replaced in order to have a seat at that table. And so I think from her metaphor, I've been thinking about rather than working, that work is important, right? I do think that work is important, but I think that rather than spending so much time, our sole energies on having that seat at the table, that we realize that there are other tables that need to be constructed and nurtured, and to have different people at those tables. And so for this work, in Indigenous research methodologies in particular, it's not for Western institutions. It is for the local communities. It's for the tribal communities to understand their sovereignty, to understand their histories, their knowledge structures, to revitalize, and refocus what's been in their communities and in their knowledge structure since time immemorial. And so in doing so, I've been working with Michael Munson, who's a mother in this project itself. But in her work, she's very careful in what she shares with people outside of the community, because her work has been devoted to the community itself. And if it's beneficial, maybe to other communities to see this in action, tribal communities in particular, then she will share it. But she's not writing for anybody else. She's writing for her community. And I think that somewhat addresses the question that you had there. Sorry, I didn't know the term.
Great answer, great answer. So we have another question. And the question is, you talked about describing your interview process. Are we seeing any movement in the IRB process that would facilitate revitalization, dialogic, Indigenous methodologies?
I mean, within the framing of the IRB itself, there was a purpose, there was a function, right? And that purpose and function was co-developed with the mothers and with the children themselves. And so the questions that were generated from that initially were co-constructed with them. And we began with some of those questions, like what does intergenerational learning look like within the home? What does Indigenous knowledge structures, how is that shaped and shared in the home and in the community? And so these are broader questions that we use to frame within the IRB that are general enough to where we could go in a number of different directions. And so that was intentional on my part, so that the work itself wasn't pigeonholed into a specific slot, but that we could just in like thinking about grounded theory, Sharma's understanding of grounded theory, that theory is co-generated, co-developed as you move along. So how do you generate theory when you already have the answer within the IRB? So I think that there's some worth in being general enough about the description, about the focus and of the question, that you can go a number of different directions and have those stories all come back to the purpose of the project itself.
Very good, very good. Another question, this is from Brianna Parker.
Hey, Brianna.
Yes, she has a question. She's, as a new faculty member, yes, let yourself be seen, there we go. In a new place in space, what are some suggestions in connecting with community members to do this kind of work, especially in the age of COVID-19?
Brianna, do you want to share a bit about what the genesis of that question?
So yes, hi, thank you so much for reading my question. And so I just kind of moved here, and I'm really interested as a first year faculty to start doing community engaged research and partnership. And prior to coming here, I was really excited because I'm not from North Carolina, but I was excited to do work with the community because I was like, oh, there'll be opportunity for me to them to see me, for me to kind of go into their spaces, to interact, to have conversations, to engage. But with COVID-19, it feels like a different type of distance, both physically and socially, but also just not kind of trusting folks who are coming from institutions. And so, which is understandable. And so, in wondering about wanting to do methodologies that do center these folks in the community and being able to co-construct research together and theory together, especially around counseling. Like, just want to know, do you have any suggestions for how you kind of cultivate and foster those relationships, especially when there's actual physical distance, but also the trying to get to know the community that you're currently moving into?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and a difficult one too, right? And I think that one we're all trying to understand and answer as we move along in this virtual space. I mean, in teaching classes, there's so much missing. I feel so sorry for the courses that I'm teaching now, because there's just that level of distance, right? That we do our best in the virtual space to make it as productive as possible, but there's so much that's missing. And I think that you can see that within, projects, research projects themselves as well. And so I don't think that we can talk or walk our way away from the real limitation of virtual research, virtual learning. There are real restrictions and distances in our humanity, even though we are face to face. With this project in particular, and with the course that I taught last semester, like the relationships began in the same physical space. We knew each other, we had an understanding of each other. And so when we went into this virtual space, that work had already been established and done. And so I don't know if I can answer your question directly, because engaging in a project from a brand new space, not having ever met them, I can't imagine how difficult that might be in showing your authenticity and your genuineness. I do think that there are some things that you can do of being in community, of being activists with people who are fighting for their humanity, for fighting to be recognized and seen and not killed. I think that there are different ways to show up within community that are safe for us, and that we can enter into meaningful relationships organically, rather than having a first meeting in an online virtual space. And so I know it's not a great answer to your question, but I do think that we need to understand the real limitations of this virtual space, and to, co-understand, co-envision ways in which we can make it work for us. But I really don't have that great of an answer for you, Brianna. I'm so sorry.
No, that's a great answer. Thank you so much for that.
Kim, what's help me understand how you're using the word authenticity, your authentic self. You've used that word quite a few times, scattered across your comments.
Yeah, well, thanks for that easy softball question, Patty. I appreciate that. I think that we have an understanding of who we are, but that also comes into contact with how others see us. And sometimes that doesn't always overlap neatly. And so for me, being Filipino American and growing up on a Native American reservation, I have understood that sometimes my internal understandings of who I am doesn't necessarily match how others position me. But it has been through the relationship and the development of those relationships with people, where we have lasting friendships and conversations that help me really understand who I am in relation to other people. And so I think for when I talk about authenticity, I'm talking about how I am coming to be, and my understanding of identity is emerging in relation to the people that I'm working with, in relation to the people who have become families to me. And so I don't think, what's that?
Sorry. Authenticity then is becoming, as opposed to this thing that
a destination
that you were and have always been. Some core that has not changed. It is in fact the relational self that you're talking about.
Absolutely. And I think that there are different ways that we can show that authenticity within our publications as well. It's showing ourselves, our identities in motion. It's showing ourselves in relation to the people that we're working with. It's showing that it's still emergent and messy. And I think that messiness is revealing of that authenticity, as you stated, Patty.
Okay.
So exciting. I think we need another article all about authenticity. I'm ready.
Right. Yes.
Well, I know that we could keep going, and I feel like I would like to. So I'm going to just take a minute to say thank you to Dr. Timothy San Pedro. Everybody, thank you so much. Yay. This is awesome. I will invite you to stick around for what usually would be us just chit-chatting with him after in the room, kind of standing in line and having a conversation. So please stay on if you would like to have that for a few minutes. Later today at 3 o'clock, Dr. Rich Milner, who is one of our alums, will be one of our guests for the Unapologetic Educational Research Series. So we hope you register and join us for that, or see the video for all these on our website. We also have some QualLab lunches, one more on in vivo this semester in November, and then next semester we're going to have a follow-up panel with Leslie Moore and colleagues. We'll also do some other events that Bakari and E and I will work on planning for next semester. We have the grad student board that is off and running with Chelsea and Bakari running that, so please know that you are welcome always to get involved. And again, thank you so much, Dr. San Pedro. I really appreciated your thoughtfulness and you sharing about storying, what that means, and intentional Indigenous methodologies, kind of the living and breathing of that and what that means for you. I think it's definitely a gift that you've given us today. So
thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll be cognizant of time, but please stick around for the after conversation if you want to chat with him. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.